The shadow of death had been following Beatrice Harper for 300 miles, and she could feel it breathing down her neck as she stumbled through the weathered doors of the only church in Wilson, Kansas, on a scorching afternoon in July of 1878. Her knees hit the rough wooden floor with a thud that echoed through the empty space, and she clasped her trembling hands together so tightly her knuckles turned white. The small church smelled of dust and old hymnals, and the heat pressed down on her like a physical weight even inside these walls. Sweat trickled down her temple as she squeezed her eyes shut and began to pray with a desperation that came from the very depths of her soul. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, if anyone is listening, I need help. I cannot go another step. I have nowhere left to run, and I am so tired. Please." Beatrice had been running for weeks, ever since she escaped from the wagon train that was supposed to take her to her aunt in California. The man her father had sold her to, a cruel merchant named Vernon Cass, who had already buried 3 wives under suspicious circumstances, had made it clear what her future would hold. When he had gotten drunk in a trading post outside of Dodge City and passed out, she had taken her chance and fled into the night with nothing but the dress on her back and a canteen of water. She had walked, hitched rides on freight wagons, and once even hidden in a cattle car on a train for 2 terrifying hours. Her once fine traveling dress was now torn and filthy, her face sunburned despite the bonnet she had lost days ago, and her feet were blistered and bleeding in her worn boots. She had arrived in Wilson that morning, drawn by the sight of the church steeple rising above the flat Kansas prairie, hoping that perhaps a man of God might offer her sanctuary or at least point her toward honest work. But the church had been empty, and exhaustion had overwhelmed her the moment she stepped inside, so she prayed because prayer was all she had left. "Your prayers are answered." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady, and Beatrice's heart nearly stopped. She whirled around, still on her knees, to find a man standing in the doorway. The afternoon sun behind him cast him in silhouette, making him look impossibly tall and broad-shouldered. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out more details. He wore dusty dark trousers, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, and a worn leather vest. A hat shadowed his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw and the concern in his eyes as he took a step closer. "I did not mean to startle you, miss," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark brown hair and a face that looked to be in his late 20s. He had the weathered appearance of a man who spent his days under the brutal prairie sun, but his eyes were kind. "I was checking on my horse outside when I heard someone in here." "Are you all right?" Beatrice struggled to find her voice. This stranger had no way of knowing what she had been praying for, yet something about the certainty in his tone when he said her prayers were answered made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. Hope, perhaps, though she had learned not to trust that feeling. "I am." She began, then stopped. What could she say? That she was running for her life, that she was alone in the world with no prospects and no protection. "I am in need of assistance," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The man took another step forward, his expression growing more concerned as he took in her appearance. She must look a fright, she realized with a flush of shame. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangles around her face. Her dress was stained with dust and sweat, and she probably looked half-starved because she was. "My name is Garrett Nelson," he said, crouching down so he was closer to her level, though he kept a respectful distance. "I work a ranch about 5 miles west of here. When is the last time you ate something?" The kindness in his question nearly broke her. "Yesterday morning," she admitted. "A woman at a farmhouse gave me some bread and cheese." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Can you stand?" Beatrice nodded and tried to rise, but her legs had other ideas. They buckled beneath her, and she would have fallen if Garrett had not moved quickly to catch her elbow. His hand was calloused and strong, steadying her with an ease that spoke of years of hard physical work. "Easy now," he said gently. "Let me help you to the bench." He guided her to the front pew, and she sank down onto it gratefully. Up close, she could see that Garrett Nelson had gray-green eyes that seemed to see too much, a straight nose that had been broken at least once, and a mouth that looked like it smiled often, though it was set in serious lines now. "Wait here," he instructed, and before she could protest, he was striding back out of the church. Beatrice sat in confused silence, wondering if he had simply decided she was not worth the trouble and left. But less than 2 minutes later, he returned carrying a canteen and what looked like a cloth bundle. "Here," he said, unstopping the canteen and handing it to her. "Drink slowly, and I have some jerky and biscuits in my saddlebag. It is not much, but it will help." Beatrice took the canteen with shaking hands and sipped the cool water. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. As she drank, Garrett unwrapped the cloth to reveal several thick pieces of jerky and 2 large biscuits. He placed them on the bench beside her. "Thank you," she managed, setting down the canteen to reach for the food. She forced herself to eat slowly, though her body screamed at her to devour everything immediately. "You are very kind." "Kindness is not letting a woman starve in a church," Garrett replied, settling onto the pew across the aisle. He gave her space, she noticed, not crowding her or demanding explanations. "Do you have people in Wilson?" Beatrice shook her head, swallowing a bite of biscuit. "I have no people anywhere, I am afraid. My mother died when I was 12 and my father passed this spring. He had debts and the man he owed money to." She trailed off, not sure how much to reveal to this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. "You do not have to tell me if you do not want to," Garrett said quietly. "But I can see you have been traveling rough for some time. Are you running from something?" There was no judgment in his tone, only concern, and something about that made Beatrice's carefully maintained composure crack. To her horror, tears began streaming down her face. "Someone," she corrected, her voice breaking. "My father owed a merchant named Vernon Cass a substantial sum. Before he died, my father made an arrangement. I was to marry Cass to settle the debt. But Cass is a terrible man. His previous wives all died under mysterious circumstances, and he drinks heavily and has a violent temper. I overheard him telling one of his associates that he would have his money's worth out of me, and when he was done, I would go the way of the others. So I ran." Garrett's expression darkened. "Vernon Cass, I have heard of him. He operates out of Dodge City, correct?" "Yes," Beatrice whispered. "Do you think he is still looking for me?" "If he paid your father's debts, he probably considers you his property," Garrett said bluntly, and Beatrice appreciated that he did not try to soften the harsh reality. "But Wilson is a long way from Dodge City, and if you have been careful, he may not know where you went." "I have been careful," Beatrice assured him. "I never told anyone my real name or where I was headed. Half the time I did not know where I was headed myself." Garrett nodded slowly, studying her with those perceptive eyes. "What is your name, miss?" "Your real name, Beatrice Harper," she said. "My friends used to call me Beatrice," he repeated, and she liked the way it sounded in his deep voice. "You said you were praying for help when I came in. What kind of help were you hoping for?" Beatrice had finished the biscuits and jerky, and she felt marginally more human with food in her stomach. She met Garrett's gaze directly. "Honest work," she said. "Somewhere to stay where I will be safe. I know how to read and write, and I can cook and clean and sew. I helped my father run his dry goods store before he died, so I know how to keep accounts. I am willing to do whatever honorable work is available. The schoolteacher position in Wilson just opened up, Garrett said thoughtfully. Old Mrs. Brennan retired last month and moved to Kansas City to live with her daughter. The town has been searching for a replacement, but most educated women do not want to come out to the middle of nowhere Kansas to teach ranch children their letters. Beatrice's heart leaped. I could do that, she said eagerly. I love children and I had a good education. My mother was a teacher before she married my father and she taught me well. The pay is not much, Garrett warned. Maybe $20 a month plus room and board. The town would provide you with living quarters attached to the schoolhouse. That sounds like heaven, Beatrice said honestly. $20 a month was more than she had dared to hope for, and her own place to live meant safety and independence. Garrett stood, settling his hat back on his head. Come on, then. I will take you to meet Mayor Harrison. He is also the owner of the general store, and he heads the committee that makes decisions about the school. If he agrees to give you the position, you will have your honest work and a place to stay. Just like that. Beatrice asked, hardly daring to believe it could be so simple. Just like that, Garrett confirmed, offering her his hand to help her up. Though I should warn you, Mayor Harrison is going to ask you a lot of questions. He takes the education of Wilson's children very seriously. Beatrice placed her hand in his and let him pull her to her feet. She swayed slightly, still weak from exhaustion and hunger, and Garrett steadied her again with a gentle hand on her elbow. Are you sure you are well enough to walk? He asked. The general store is only 2 blocks from here, but I can bring the mayor to you if you need to rest longer. I can walk, Beatrice assured him. She had walked 300 miles to get here. She could manage 2 more blocks. They emerged from the dim church into the bright afternoon sunlight, and Beatrice squinted against the glare. Wilson was not a large town, just a main street with perhaps a dozen buildings clustered around it, and scattered houses spreading out in all directions across the prairie. She could see the general store Garrett had mentioned along with a saloon, a feed store, a blacksmith, and what looked like a doctor's office. Garrett's horse, a magnificent bay gelding, was tied to the hitching post outside the church. The animal nickered softly as they approached, and Garrett patted its neck affectionately before untying the reins. This is Copper, he said. He is the best horse I have ever owned. I would offer to let you ride him to the store, but he is not used to carrying anyone but me, and I would hate for you to fall. I can walk, Beatrice repeated, though she was grateful when Garrett slowed his pace to match her limping steps. Her blistered feet were protesting every movement, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. She had endured worse than this. As they walked down the dusty main street, several people stopped to stare at them. A woman in a faded calico dress standing outside the feed store watched them pass with open curiosity. 2 men sitting on the porch of the saloon paused their conversation to look. Beatrice felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, knowing what a spectacle she must present in her filthy, torn dress with her hair in complete disarray. People are staring, she murmured to Garrett. Wilson is a small town, he replied easily. They stare at everything new or unusual. Do not worry about them. By tomorrow, they will have moved on to some other piece of gossip. The general store was a substantial wooden building with a covered porch and large windows displaying various goods. A sign hanging above the door read Harrison's General Store in bold black letters. Garrett held the door open for Beatrice, and she stepped inside. The interior was dim and cool after the bright heat outside, and it smelled pleasantly of coffee, spices, and new fabric. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crammed with everything from canned goods to farming equipment to bolts of cloth. A long counter ran along one side of the room, and behind it stood a portly man with graying hair and spectacles perched on his nose. "Garrett," the man said, looking up with a smile that faded to concern when he saw Beatrice. "Good Lord, what happened to this young lady, Mayor Harrison? This is Miss Beatrice Harper," Garrett said. "She just arrived in Wilson, and she is interested in the schoolteacher position." "Miss Harper, this is Arthur Harrison, our mayor and the finest merchant in 50 miles. Arthur came around the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. He was perhaps in his late 50s, with kind brown eyes and a weathered face that spoke of many years on the frontier. "Miss Harper, please, sit down before you fall down. Martha," he called toward the back of the store, "bring some water and something for this young lady to eat." "That is very kind, but Garrett already gave me food," Beatrice said, though she sank gratefully into the chair Arthur indicated. Her legs were trembling from the short walk. A woman emerged from the back room, presumably Martha Harrison. She was a handsome woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and a capable air about her. Her eyes widened when she saw Beatrice. "Arthur, the poor dear looks ready to collapse," she said, bustling over. "When did you last have a proper meal, child?" "A few days ago," Beatrice admitted. Martha exchanged a glance with her husband. "I am bringing her soup and bread, and I will not hear any arguments about it. Garrett, you sit down too. You look like you could use a cold drink." As Martha disappeared into the back room again, presumably where the family's living quarters were located, Arthur pulled up another chair and sat down facing Beatrice. Garrett remained standing, holding Copper's reins, but he moved closer. "Now then, Miss Harper," Arthur said gently. "Garrett mentioned you are interested in our teaching position. May I ask about your qualifications?" Beatrice straightened her spine, trying to project competence despite her bedraggled appearance. "My mother was a teacher in St. Louis before she married my father," she began. "She educated me herself, and I can read, write, and cipher. I know history, geography, and literature. I can also teach basic Latin and French, as my mother was fluent in both. After my mother died, I helped my father run his dry goods store, so I am accustomed to working with the public and keeping accounts. I am patient, I love children, and I am willing to work very hard." Arthur nodded slowly. "Those are impressive qualifications. May I ask why you are in Wilson? Do you have family here?" This was the difficult part. Beatrice glanced at Garrett, who gave her an encouraging nod. She took a deep breath and told the Harrisons an abbreviated version of what she had told Garrett. Her father's death, his debts, the arrangement he had made with Vernon Cass, and her decision to run rather than marry a man she knew to be dangerous. When she finished, Martha had returned with a tray bearing a bowl of steaming beef soup, fresh bread, butter, and a glass of cool milk. She set it on a small table beside Beatrice and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You poor brave girl," Martha said softly. "You did the right thing, running from that terrible man." Arthur's expression had grown stern as she spoke, but Beatrice could tell his anger was not directed at her. "Vernon Cass," he said, shaking his head. "I met him once, years ago, when he was passing through Wilson with a wagon train. I did not care for him then, and it sounds as though my instincts were correct. Miss Harper, you are safe here. Wilson may be small, but we take care of our own, and if we hire you as our teacher, you will be one of us." "Then you will hire me?" Beatrice asked, hardly daring to hope. "I am not the only one who gets to decide," Arthur said. "The school board consists of myself, Reverend Parker, and Doc Thornton. But I carry considerable weight on the board, and I believe you are exactly what Wilson needs. Doc Thornton is out visiting the Miller Ranch today to deliver a baby, but Reverend Parker lives next to the church. Garrett, would you be willing to fetch him? I think we can have this settled within the hour." "Of course," Garrett said. "I will be right back." He handed Copper's reins to Arthur and headed back out into the street. As Beatrice ate the delicious soup and bread, Martha fussed over her, insisting on examining her blistered feet and applying some kind of soothing salve to them. Arthur asked her more questions about her education and what she would teach, and Beatrice answered as best she could between bites. "We have about 20 children of school age in Wilson and the surrounding ranches," Arthur explained. "Ages range from 6 to 15. Some of them can barely write their own names. Mrs. Brennan was a fine woman, but she was quite elderly and had difficulty keeping the older boys in line. I hope you will not have the same trouble, but if you do, you come to me or the Reverend or Doc Thornton, and we will set those boys straight." "I am sure I can manage," Beatrice said, though privately she wondered if a 19-year-old woman would be able to command the respect of 15-year-old ranch boys who probably outweighed her by a considerable margin. Still, she would find a way. She had to. Garrett returned a few minutes later with an elderly man in ministerial black. Reverend Parker was thin and stooped with age, but his blue eyes were sharp and intelligent. He studied Beatrice with an intensity that made her sit up straighter. "Miss Harper," he said in a reedy voice. "Garrett tells me you were praying in my church when he found you." "Yes, sir," Beatrice confirmed. "I hope that was all right. I needed guidance, and a church seemed like the right place to seek it." "It is always the right place to seek guidance," the Reverend agreed. He pulled up a chair and sat down with a slight groan. "Garrett also tells me you are interested in teaching our children. What would you teach them about morality and character?" This was clearly a test, and Beatrice considered her answer carefully. "I would teach them that honesty, kindness, and hard work are the foundations of good character," she said. "I would teach them to treat others as they wish to be treated, regardless of that person's station or circumstances. I would teach them that education is a privilege and a responsibility, and that knowledge should be used to better oneself and one's community." Reverend Parker smiled for the first time. "A fine answer. Arthur, I vote yes on hiring Miss Harper. When can she start?" Arthur looked surprised but pleased. "I thought you might want to question her more extensively, Reverend." "I am a good judge of character, and this young woman has it in spades," the Reverend replied. "Besides, God works in mysterious ways. She prayed for help and Garrett found her." "That seems like divine providence to me," Martha laughed. "I agree with the Reverend. Welcome to Wilson, Miss Harper. Let me show you to your new home." Everything happened so quickly after that. Arthur drew up a simple contract for Beatrice to sign, promising her $20 a month in salary paid quarterly, plus the use of the schoolhouse living quarters. The school term would begin in 3 weeks, on August 5th, which gave her time to prepare and recover from her ordeal. Martha insisted on giving Beatrice 2 new dresses, a nightgown, undergarments, and a pair of sturdy boots from the store's stock. "You can pay me back from your first salary," she said firmly when Beatrice tried to protest. "Consider it an investment in our children's education." The schoolhouse was a whitewashed building at the edge of town, with a small bell tower and large windows to let in light. The main room held rows of rough wooden desks and benches, a blackboard at the front, and a large pot-bellied stove for winter heating. The teachers' quarters were attached to the back, a single room with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a miniature stove for cooking. It was simple and spare, but to Beatrice it looked like paradise. "We will bring you some supplies to get started," Martha promised. "Linens for the bed, dishes, food staples. Is there anything else you need?" "Books," Beatrice said immediately. "Do you have textbooks for the children?" Mrs. Brennan left behind a collection, Arthur said, gesturing to a locked cabinet in the main schoolroom. Primers, readers, arithmetic books, and some geography and history texts. They are a bit outdated, but they will serve. The school budget might stretch to purchase some new materials if you find you need them. As the Harrisons bustled about making lists and plans, Garrett stood quietly in the doorway of the schoolhouse, watching. Beatrice caught his eye and moved over to speak with him. "Thank you," she said softly. "If you had not found me in that church, I do not know what would have happened to me." "I am glad I was there," Garrett replied. His gray-green eyes were warm as they looked down at her. "You are going to do well here, Beatrice, I can tell. How can you be so certain? You barely know me." "I know you are brave enough to run 300 miles from danger," Garrett said. "I know you are determined enough to keep going even when you were starving and exhausted. I know you value education and honest work. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Beatrice felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "Will I see you again?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for being so forward. But Garrett smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something beautiful. "I come into town most Saturdays for supplies," he said. "And I imagine I will find excuses to come more often now that Wilson has a pretty new school teacher." Beatrice blushed and smiled back, feeling something shift in her heart. This man had appeared in that church like an answer to her desperate prayer, and now he was looking at her as though she was something precious. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. Over the next 3 weeks, Beatrice threw herself into preparing for her new role. Martha Harrison became her closest friend and mentor, teaching her about the families in Wilson and the children she would be teaching. The Harrisons invited her to dinner several times, and she met more of the townspeople. Doc Thornton, a gruff but kind-hearted man in his 40s, the blacksmith, a giant named Peter Schmidt who spoke with a thick German accent, the saloon owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance Vale who kept order in her establishment with an iron fist and a shotgun behind the bar. Everyone welcomed her warmly, and Beatrice began to feel something she had not felt since her mother died, a sense of belonging. She organized the schoolhouse, cleaned every surface until it gleamed, studied the textbooks so she could plan her lessons, and even crafted some simple teaching aids from materials Martha gave her. And every Saturday, just as he had promised, Garrett came to town. He would arrive mid-morning, tie copper outside the general store and conduct his business, buying supplies, picking up mail, sometimes visiting the blacksmith or stopping by the saloon for a drink. But he always made time to visit Beatrice at the schoolhouse. He helped her move some heavy desks, repaired a loose board in the floor of her quarters, and brought her wildflowers he had picked on the prairie. They talked for hours during those visits. Garrett told her about his life. He was 27 years old and had come to Kansas 5 years earlier with dreams of starting his own ranch. He had worked for a large rancher named Thomas Crawford for 3 years, saving every penny, and 2 years ago had been able to purchase a small piece of land and a modest herd of cattle. It was hard work running a ranch alone, but he loved the freedom and the challenge. "Why did you come west?" Beatrice asked him one Saturday afternoon as they sat on the schoolhouse steps drinking lemonade Martha had sent over. "I grew up in Missouri, on a farm outside of Independence," Garrett replied. "I was the youngest of 5 boys, and there was no land for me to inherit. My older brothers were going to divide the farm between them, and I knew I would just be hired help forever if I stayed. So when I turned 22, I packed a bag, said goodbye to my family, and headed west. I wanted to build something of my own, something I could be proud of." "And have you?" Beatrice asked. "Built something to be proud of," Garrett smiled. "I am getting there. My ranch is small, only about 300 acres and maybe 200 head of cattle, but it is mine. The land is paid for, and if I can get my herd through the winter without losing too many, I should be able to expand next year." He paused, then added more quietly, "I always thought a ranch needed more than just cattle and land to be complete, though. What else does it need?" Beatrice asked, though something in her chest was fluttering in a way that suggested she already knew the answer. "A family," Garrett said, meeting her eyes. "A wife to share the work and the rewards, children to raise and teach. A real home, not just a place to sleep between long days of labor." Beatrice swallowed hard. "That sounds like a fine dream." "It is," Garrett agreed. "And lately I have been wondering if maybe it does not have to stay just a dream." Before Beatrice could respond to that loaded statement, they were interrupted by the arrival of a wagon. Peter Schmidt, the blacksmith, was driving, and beside him sat a young woman Beatrice had not met before. She was perhaps 17 or 18, with honey-colored hair in braids and a pretty face, though her expression was sullen. "Miss Harper," Peter called in his heavily accented English. "This is my niece, Helena. She will be one of your students." Helena Schmidt climbed down from the wagon with obvious reluctance and stood with her arms crossed, glaring at nothing in particular. Peter sighed heavily. "Helena is very smart, but she does not like school," he said apologetically. "Her parents sent her from Pennsylvania to live with me because they hope the change will be good for her. I hope she will not give you trouble." "I am sure we will get along fine," Beatrice said with a confidence she did not quite feel. She approached Helena and offered her hand. "It is nice to meet you, Helena. I am looking forward to having you in class." Helena looked at her hand as though it were a snake, but after a long moment she shook it limply. "You look young to be a teacher," she said rudely. "I am 19, Beatrice replied calmly. "Old enough to have learned a great deal and young enough to remember what it is like to be a student. I hope you will give me a chance before you decide to dislike me." Something flickered in Helena's eyes, surprise perhaps. She shrugged. "I guess we will see." After Peter and Helena left, Garrett laughed softly. "That one is going to be a handful." "Probably," Beatrice agreed. "But I think underneath all that anger there is a smart young woman who needs someone to believe in her. I am willing to try." "You have a good heart, Beatrice Harper," Garrett said, and the way he said it made her feel like she could conquer anything. The night before school was set to begin, Beatrice could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and reviewing her lesson plans for the 100th time. What if the children did not listen to her? What if she could not maintain discipline? What if she was terrible at teaching and the town regretted hiring her? And underneath all those anxieties was another fear, one she barely wanted to acknowledge even to herself. What if Vernon Cass found her? She had heard nothing from or about him in the weeks since she arrived in Wilson, but that did not mean he had given up looking. Men like Cass did not like to lose what they considered theirs, and he had paid her father's debts. In his mind, she belonged to him, and he would want to reclaim his property. Beatrice shivered despite the warm night and pulled the quilt Martha had given her up to her chin. She thought about Garrett, about the way he looked at her and the growing feelings in her own heart. She was falling in love with him, she realized. It was foolish and dangerous to let herself care for someone when she was still technically being hunted, but she could not seem to help it. Garrett was everything Vernon Cass was not: kind, honest, hardworking, and gentle. When he smiled at her, she felt safe. When he touched her hand to help her over a rough patch of ground or steady her on the schoolhouse steps, electricity seemed to spark between them. And the way he talked about his dream of a family, looking directly at her as he spoke, made her imagine a future she had never dared to dream of before. But she was getting ahead of herself. They had known each other less than a month. It was far too soon to be thinking about futures and families. First, she had to prove herself as a teacher. Everything else would have to wait. The first day of school arrived with a brilliant sunrise that painted the Kansas sky in shades of pink and gold. Beatrice dressed carefully in one of the simple calico dresses Martha had given her, braided her hair in a neat coronet, and forced herself to eat a small breakfast even though her stomach was in knots. The children began arriving at 8 o'clock. Some came on foot from town. Others arrived in wagons driven by parents from the outlying farms and ranches. Beatrice stood at the schoolhouse door and greeted each one, learning names and faces as quickly as she could. There was Samuel Miller, age 6, with a gap-toothed grin and an armful of frogs he wanted to show her. His older sister, Margaret, age 12, firmly confiscated the frogs and apologized. The Johnson twins, Emma and Ethan, age 10, who looked so identical Beatrice knew she would have trouble telling them apart. Little Lucy Crawford, age 7, who clung shyly to her older brother David's hand. David was 14, tall and gangly, and he blushed bright red when Beatrice smiled at him. And then there was Helena Schmidt, who arrived last and slouched into a desk in the back row without making eye contact. When all 20 children were seated, Beatrice stood at the front of the room and took a deep breath. "Good morning," she said, projecting her voice so even the students in the back could hear clearly. "My name is Miss Harper, and I am your new teacher. I am very happy to be here in Wilson, and I am looking forward to getting to know all of you." 20 pairs of eyes stared back at her with varying degrees of interest, skepticism, and in Helena's case, outright hostility. Beatrice pushed forward. "This year we are going to learn many things together," she continued. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and science. But more importantly, we are going to learn how to think, how to question, and how to discover the world through knowledge. Education is not just about memorizing facts. It is about opening your minds to new possibilities." She could see some of the children perking up with interest. Others still looked doubtful. That was all right. She had time to win them over. The first day went better than Beatrice had dared to hope. She started by assessing each child's current skill level, having them read aloud or work simple arithmetic problems so she could understand where to begin. The range was vast. Little Samuel could barely recognize his letters, while Helena, despite her bad attitude, read from an advanced text with perfect fluency and solved complex mathematical problems with ease. At lunchtime, the children scattered outside to eat the meals they had brought from home. Beatrice sat on the schoolhouse steps with her own simple lunch of bread and cheese, watching them play. Most of the children seemed to be getting along, though she noticed Helena sat apart from the others, eating alone under a tree. After lunch, Beatrice taught a history lesson about the American Revolution. She did not just recite facts from the textbook, but told the story dramatically, making the children feel like they were there witnessing the events. Even the older boys, who she had worried might be troublemakers, paid attention. By the time 3 o'clock came and she dismissed the class, Beatrice was exhausted but exhilarated. She had done it. She had survived her first day as a teacher, and it had gone well. As the children filed out, Helena was the last to leave. She paused at the door, and for a moment, Beatrice thought she might say something. But then she just shook her head and walked out. "Give her time," said a voice from the doorway. Beatrice looked up to see Martha Harrison standing there with a basket over her arm. "I brought you some supper, dear. I figured you would be too tired to cook." "You are a saint," Beatrice said gratefully, accepting the basket. "Thank you, Martha, and thank you for believing in me." "How did it go today?" Martha asked. "Better than I expected," Beatrice admitted. "The children were mostly well-behaved, and I think I am starting to understand how to reach them. Helena Schmidt is going to be a challenge, though. That girl has been through a lot, Martha said sadly. Her father lost his job back in Pennsylvania and started drinking heavily. He was not kind to Helena or her mother when he drank. They sent her out here hoping Peter could provide a better environment, but she is angry about being uprooted from everything she knew. That explains a great deal, Beatrice said softly. I will try to be patient with her. I know you will, Martha replied, patting her hand. Now eat your supper and get some rest. You have earned it. The days settled into a routine. Beatrice taught Monday through Friday, spending her evenings preparing lessons and her Sundays attending church services with the rest of the town. The children gradually warmed to her, even the initially skeptical older boys. She discovered that Samuel Miller was fascinated by anything to do with animals, so she incorporated natural science into his reading lessons. Margaret Miller had a gift for numbers, and Beatrice gave her advanced arithmetic problems to work on. David Crawford wrote beautiful, thoughtful essays when given the chance, and Helena Schmidt remained a puzzle. She was clearly brilliant, devouring every book Beatrice gave her and completing assignments with perfection. But she never participated in class discussions, never socialized with the other children, and responded to any attempt at personal conversation with monosyllables or silence. Beatrice refused to give up on her. She began leaving books on Helena's desk, ones she thought the girl might enjoy, adventure stories, books about far-off places, even some poetry. Helena would pick them up without comment and return them a few days later, always perfectly cared for but with no indication whether she had liked them. Through it all, Garrett continued his Saturday visits. As summer faded into early autumn and the prairie grass turned gold, their relationship deepened. They did not just talk anymore. Sometimes they walked together through town or out onto the prairie, and Garrett told her about his ranch, describing the rolling hills and the creek that ran through his property. Beatrice told him about her childhood, about her mother's love of learning and her father's slow decline after her mother's death. One Saturday, in late September, Garrett arrived with a wagon instead of just copper. I thought maybe you would like to see the ranch, he said, looking suddenly uncertain. If that would be appropriate, Martha could come as a chaperone if you think it necessary. Beatrice's heart leaped at the invitation. I would love to see your ranch, she said, and I trust you, Garrett. I do not think we need a chaperone for an afternoon drive. The smile that lit up his face made her knees weak. The drive to Garrett's ranch took about 40 minutes, following a well-worn track across the prairie. The land seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, an ocean of grass beneath an enormous sky. Beatrice had grown up in towns and cities, and the sheer vastness of the Kansas prairie was both frightening and exhilarating. It is so big, she breathed, staring out at the horizon. I have never seen so much open space. Some people find it lonely, Garrett said, but I find it peaceful. Out here you can hear yourself think. As they crested a low hill, Garrett's ranch came into view. It was modest but well-maintained. A sturdy wooden house with a covered porch, a barn, a corral with several horses, and pastures where cattle grazed. Everything was neat and organized, speaking to the care Garrett put into his property. It is not much yet, Garrett said as he helped Beatrice down from the wagon, but I am building it up slowly. I added on to the house last year and I plan to expand the barn next spring. It is wonderful, Beatrice said honestly. The house was small, probably just 2 or 3 rooms, but it was solid and welcoming. Garrett had planted some cottonwood trees near the house for shade, and she could see a vegetable garden beside the kitchen entrance. Garrett showed her around, clearly proud of what he had accomplished. The barn was clean and well organized, the horses healthy and well cared for. The cattle looked fat and content. It was obvious that Garrett was a good rancher who took his responsibilities seriously. "Would you like to see inside the house?" he asked, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made Beatrice's heart ache. "Very much," she replied. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cook stove, a table with 4 chairs, and a couple of worn but comfortable-looking chairs near a fireplace. A doorway led to what was presumably the bedroom. Everything was neat and clean, but it had the sparse, utilitarian feel of a place where a bachelor lived alone. "I built most of the furniture myself," Garrett said, running his hand along the smooth wood of the table. "I am not a master carpenter, but I can make things sturdy and functional." "You built this?" Beatrice asked, impressed. She traced her fingers over the tabletop, which was beautifully smooth and even. "It is lovely." They stood there in the quiet house, and suddenly the air between them felt charged with possibility. Garrett turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made Beatrice's breath catch. "Beatrice," he said softly, "I need to tell you something. I have been trying to find the right words for weeks, but there is no perfect way to say this, so I am just going to speak plainly. I am falling in love with you." Beatrice's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Garrett, please, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know we have only known each other a few months, and I know you came here running from one man and probably have no desire to tie yourself to another. But I cannot keep pretending what I feel for you is just friendship. You are intelligent, brave, kind, and beautiful. When I am with you, I feel like I can be my best self, and when I imagine my future now, I cannot imagine it without you in it." Tears were streaming down Beatrice's face, but they were happy tears. "Oh, Garrett," she whispered, "I am falling in love with you too. I have been terrified to admit it because everything is still so uncertain. Vernon Cass could still find me. He could still try to claim me. I have no right to let you care for me when my presence might bring danger to you." Garrett closed the distance between them and gently cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "I am not afraid of Vernon Cass or any other man," he said firmly. "You are not property to be claimed, Beatrice. You are a free woman with the right to choose your own future. And if you choose me, I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret it." "I do choose you," Beatrice said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I choose you, Garrett Nelson." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was Beatrice's first kiss, and it was everything she had ever dreamed a kiss could be. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "I want to marry you," Garrett said. "Not right away if you need more time, but someday soon. I want you to be my wife, Beatrice. I want to build a life with you here on this ranch. I want to give you children and grow old with you." "I want that too," Beatrice replied. "More than anything, but I want to finish the school term first. I made a commitment to Wilson and I need to honor it. Can you wait until next summer?" "I would wait forever for you," Garrett said simply. "But next summer sounds perfect. It will give us time to plan properly and give you time to be certain. I want you to have no doubts." "I have no doubts about you," Beatrice assured him. "Only about whether I deserve such happiness." "You deserve every happiness in the world," Garrett said, kissing her forehead. "And I intend to spend my life proving it to you." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the ranch, talking and planning and dreaming. Garrett showed her where he wanted to expand the house to add more bedrooms for the children they hoped to have. Beatrice described how she would plant a flower garden and maybe keep some chickens. They talked about practical matters like finances and what Beatrice would do about her teaching after they married. Garrett insisted she could continue if she wanted, though the commute would be difficult. Or you could teach our children and any ranch children in the area," he suggested. "There are several families within 5 miles of here with young ones who would benefit from schooling." "That could work," Beatrice said thoughtfully. "I could hold classes here at the ranch a few days a week. It would be a smaller school, but perhaps more personal." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Garrett drove Beatrice back to Wilson. When they arrived at the schoolhouse, he helped her down from the wagon and kissed her again, this time with more passion but still with respect and tenderness. "I will see you next Saturday," he promised, "and every Saturday after that until you are mine forever." "I am already yours," Beatrice said, smiling up at him. "I have been since the day you walked into that church and told me my prayers were answered." The autumn passed in a blur of happiness. Beatrice threw herself into teaching with renewed energy, and her students thrived under her care. Samuel Miller learned to read and developed an impressive collection of interesting rocks and feathers. Margaret Miller was now working on problems that would challenge a high school student. David Crawford showed her a short story he had written, and it was genuinely good. Even Helena Schmidt was making progress, though it was slow. Beatrice had taken to asking her to stay after class sometimes to help organize books or clean the blackboard, using the one-on-one time to try to draw the girl out. Helena remained guarded, but occasionally Beatrice would catch a glimmer of something softer beneath the armor. One afternoon in late October, as Helena was shelving books, Beatrice said casually, "There is a poetry collection I think you might enjoy. It is by a woman named Emily Dickinson. Her poems are about nature, death, love, and loneliness. They are quite beautiful." Helena paused. "I do not usually like poetry." "That is all right," Beatrice replied. "But if you change your mind, the book will be on your desk tomorrow." The next day, Helena picked up the book without comment. 3 days later, she returned it, and as she set it on Beatrice's desk, she said quietly, "The one about hope being a thing with feathers was my favorite." It was the first time Helena had voluntarily expressed an opinion about anything, and Beatrice felt a surge of triumph. "That is one of my favorites too," she said. "Would you like to talk about why you liked it?" Helena hesitated, then shook her head. "Maybe another time." "Whenever you are ready," Beatrice assured her. Garrett proposed officially in November, on a cold, clear evening when the stars seemed close enough to touch. He came to the schoolhouse after supper with a small velvet box in his pocket, and nervously asked Beatrice to take a walk with him despite the chill. They walked to the church where they had first met, and Garrett led her inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the moonlight streaming through the windows. "This is where it all started," Garrett said softly. "You were kneeling right there, praying for help, and I walked through that door. I did not know it then, but that was the moment my life changed forever. That was the moment I met the woman I would love for the rest of my days." He dropped to one knee, and Beatrice's hands flew to her mouth. "Beatrice Harper, will you marry me?" Garrett asked, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small but perfect diamond. "I know it is not fancy, but it is perfect," Beatrice interrupted, tears streaming down her face again. "Yes, Garrett, yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made just for her. Then he stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her with a joy and passion that made her dizzy. They were married on June 23, 1879, in the same church where they had met. Beatrice wore a simple white dress that Martha Harrison had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair. Garrett wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Beatrice could barely catch her breath when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. Reverend Parker performed the ceremony, and the entire town of Wilson turned out to witness it. Arthur and Martha Harrison stood as their witnesses. Peter Schmidt gave Beatrice away since she had no family of her own, and to Beatrice's surprise and delight, Helena Schmidt was there, wearing a new dress and actually smiling. "I wanted to thank you," Helena said quietly to Beatrice before the ceremony began, "for not giving up on me, for seeing me when I did not want to be seen. You are the best teacher I have ever had." "And you are one of the best students I have ever had," Beatrice replied, hugging the girl tightly. "Never forget how smart and capable you are, Helena. You are going to do great things." The ceremony was simple and beautiful. When Reverend Parker pronounced them husband and wife and Garrett kissed her, Beatrice felt a completeness she had never known existed. This was what home felt like. This was what love felt like. The town threw them a celebration at the church social hall, with food and music and dancing. Beatrice danced with Garrett, with Arthur Harrison, with Peter Schmidt, and even with young David Crawford, who had worked up the courage to ask. Garrett danced with Martha, with several of the ranch women, and with little Lucy Crawford, who giggled the entire time. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Garrett drove Beatrice home to the ranch in the decorated wagon. Their friends had tied ribbons to it and attached a sign that read, "Just married." Beatrice laughed at the spectacle and waved to everyone as they drove away. The ranch house had been transformed. Garrett had spent the last month making improvements, adding curtains to the windows, building more furniture, and even installing a new cookstove. But the biggest surprise was a bookshelf he had built in the main room, already filled with books he had ordered from Kansas City. "I know how much you love reading," he said, watching her face light up, "and I want you to always have that joy in our home." "Garrett Nelson, I love you so much," Beatrice said, throwing her arms around his neck. "I love you too, Mrs. Nelson," he replied, and Beatrice thrilled at the sound of her new name. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle touches. Garrett was patient and kind, making sure Beatrice felt safe and cherished. And when she woke the next morning in his arms, watching the sun rise over the prairie through their bedroom window, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Married life suited them both. Beatrice continued teaching, but now she held classes at the ranch 3 days a week for the children of nearby families. She had 8 students, ranging in age from 5 to 13, and she loved the intimate atmosphere of the smaller school. The main Wilson schoolhouse had hired a new teacher, a middle-aged widow named Mrs. Fletcher who had moved from Indiana, so the town children were well cared for. Garrett's ranch continued to prosper. With Beatrice's help keeping the books and managing the household, he was able to focus more on the cattle and land management. They purchased more acreage and expanded the herd. Garrett hired a young ranch hand named Timothy to help with the work, and the boy turned out to be a hard worker and fast learner. Life was good, but it became even better when Beatrice realized in early December that she was expecting a child. She waited until she was certain before telling Garrett, and when she finally shared the news one evening over supper, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, lifted her off her feet despite her protests, and spun her around the kitchen. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." "We are," Beatrice confirmed, laughing at his exuberance. "In late June or early July, if my calculations are correct." Garrett immediately became protective and attentive, insisting that Beatrice rest more and not overwork herself. She rolled her eyes at his fussing but secretly loved it. After a lifetime of having no one truly care for her well-being, having a husband who worried about whether she was getting enough sleep or eating properly felt wonderful. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Beatrice experienced some morning sickness in the early months that made teaching challenging. Her students were patient with her, and little Sarah Mitchell, one of her ranch students, even brought her ginger tea her mother had made, which helped settle her stomach. In May, Beatrice gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, but Doc Thornton was there to help, along with Martha Harrison and 2 other experienced ranch women. When Beatrice finally held her son in her arms, she wept with overwhelming love. "He is perfect," Garrett said, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he looked down at his son. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but now that the baby was actually here, Beatrice knew exactly what his name should be. "Grant," she said. "Grant Matthew Nelson. Grant for his strength and Matthew for your middle name." "Grant Matthew Nelson," Garrett repeated, testing it out. "I like it. Welcome to the world, Grant." Being parents was harder than either of them had anticipated, but also more rewarding. Grant was a fussy baby who did not sleep well, and for the first few months, Beatrice felt like she was stumbling through her days in an exhausted fog. But Garrett was a hands-on father, taking night shifts with the baby so Beatrice could rest, and gradually they found their rhythm. Beatrice had to suspend her teaching while Grant was tiny, but by the time he was 6 months old, she was able to resume classes with Grant sleeping in a basket beside her desk. Her students adored the baby and took turns helping rock him when he fussed. The years passed in a blur of joy and challenges. When Grant was 2, Beatrice gave birth to a daughter they named Grace Ellen. Grace was an easier baby than Grant had been, sleeping well and smiling often. 2 years after Grace came another son, George Thomas, who inherited his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's determined chin. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Garrett had to hire 2 more ranch hands as the herd expanded, and he built a larger barn and added several more rooms to the house to accommodate their growing family. Beatrice taught in the mornings and managed the household in the afternoons, somehow finding time to can vegetables, make preserves, sew clothing, and keep the accounts. She was constantly tired but deeply content. Helena Schmidt remained in contact with Beatrice over the years, writing letters from Pennsylvania, where she had returned to attend a women's college. She was studying to become a teacher herself, inspired by Beatrice's example. "You showed me that education could be a source of joy rather than obligation," Helena wrote. "You changed my life, and I want to do the same for other young women." When Grant was 5 years old, a stranger came to Wilson asking about Beatrice. The man was a private investigator hired by Vernon Cass, who had never given up looking for the woman he considered his property. Arthur Harrison, who encountered the investigator first, immediately denied knowing anyone named Beatrice Harper and suggested the man try the next town over. Then Arthur rode out to the Nelson ranch to warn them. Beatrice felt her old fear return in a rush when Arthur told them about the investigator. She had been happy and safe for so long that she had allowed herself to believe Vernon Cass had given up or forgotten about her. But apparently, his obsession had not faded. "What do we do?" she asked Garrett, trying to keep her voice steady even though she was shaking. Grant and Grace were playing in the yard and George was napping. She could not let this threat touch her children. "We protect our family," Garrett said firmly. "Arthur, did the investigator say where he was staying?" "The saloon in Wilson for now," Arthur replied. "Constance is keeping an eye on him. She does not like strangers poking around asking questions about her friends." "Good," Garrett said. "I am going to have a conversation with this man and make it very clear that his employer's claim on my wife is invalid. Beatrice and I are legally married. She is no longer Beatrice Harper but Beatrice Nelson, and she is under my protection." "I am coming with you," Arthur said. "And I will bring Doc Thornton and Peter Schmidt. We will make sure this investigator understands that Wilson takes care of its own." "I should come too," Beatrice said, but Garrett shook his head. "No, my love. Stay here with the children. If this man sees you, he will report back to Cass that he found you. If he does not see you, we can sow doubt. We can convince him to look elsewhere." Beatrice wanted to argue, but she knew Garrett was right. She watched from the porch as Garrett rode off with Arthur, her heart in her throat. The confrontation in Wilson was brief and decisive. The investigator, a thin, oily man named Silas Reed, found himself facing 4 angry men who made it very clear that he was not welcome. Garrett, Arthur, Doc Thornton, and Peter Schmidt cornered him in the saloon, with Constance Vale standing behind the bar with her shotgun in plain view. "There is no one in Wilson named Beatrice Harper," Garrett said coldly. "And if there were, she would be none of your employer's business. Any contract made by her late father died with him. Now I suggest you finish your drink, get on your horse, and ride back to Dodge City with a message for Vernon Cass. Tell him to stop looking. Tell him if he or anyone he hires sets foot near my family, he will regret it." Silas Reed was not a brave man, and faced with 4 determined men and an armed saloon owner, he quickly agreed. He left Wilson that afternoon and never returned. 3 weeks later, they received word that Vernon Cass had died. Apparently, he had been shot in a gambling dispute in Dodge City, killed by a man whose wife Cass had insulted. It was an ignoble end for an ignoble man, and while Beatrice did not celebrate his death, she felt an enormous relief knowing the threat was finally, truly over. "It is finished," she told Garrett that night as they lay in bed. "I am finally free of him." "You were always free," Garrett replied, pulling her close. "But I am glad you can feel it now." The years continued to pass. Grant grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved working on the ranch with his father. Grace was artistic and creative, always drawing pictures or making up stories. George was adventurous and bold, constantly getting into scrapes that gave his mother gray hairs. When Grant was 10, they had another child, a daughter they named Gwendolyn Rose. Gwen was a surprise but a welcome one, completing their family. By the time Gwen was born, the Nelson Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the county. Garrett had tripled the size of his herd and his land, and he was known throughout Kansas as a fair employer and skilled rancher. Beatrice continued teaching, now focusing on her own children and a handful of neighbor children. She had also begun writing, compiling her teaching experiences and philosophies into essays that were published in educational journals back east. She gained a modest reputation as an education reformer, advocating for more progressive teaching methods and better support for rural schools. The children grew and thrived. Grant went to agricultural college and came back to help run the ranch, eventually taking over most of the day-to-day operations as Garrett's joints began to ache with age. Grace married a lawyer from Kansas City and moved to the city, but she visited often and wrote beautiful letters. George became a veterinarian, setting up his practice in Wilson and taking care of animals throughout the county. Gwen was still young, but she showed signs of inheriting her mother's love of teaching. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Garrett and Beatrice sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sun set over the prairie. They were both in their 50s now, their hair graying and their faces lined, but their love had only deepened with time. "You remember the day we met?" Garrett asked, taking Beatrice's hand. "Every detail," Beatrice replied. "I was kneeling in that church praying for help and you walked in and told me my prayers were answered. At the time, I thought you were being presumptuous. Garrett laughed. I probably was, but I was also right, was I not? You were absolutely right, Beatrice confirmed. You were the answer to my prayers, Garrett Nelson. You saved my life that day in more ways than one. You saved mine too, Garrett said seriously. I was just going through the motions before I met you, building a ranch but not really living. You gave me purpose, love, and a family. You gave me everything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as Grant and his wife worked with the cattle in the distance. Their grandchildren played in the yard, 3 towering boys and 2 girls who were the image of their mother. It was a beautiful sight, the legacy they had built together. We did well, did we not? Beatrice asked softly. We did better than well, Garrett replied. We built something real and lasting. We raised good children. We contributed to our community. We loved each other every single day. What more could anyone ask for? Nothing, Beatrice said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Absolutely nothing. I have everything I ever wanted right here. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant purples and golds, Beatrice thought back to that desperate young woman who had stumbled into a church in Wilson, Kansas, 25 years ago. She had been running from danger, exhausted, starving, and hopeless. She had prayed for help, not knowing if anyone was listening or if she would ever be safe again. And then Garrett had appeared like an answer to that prayer, and everything had changed. Their love story had not been easy. They had faced challenges, dangers, and hardships. But they had faced them together, and that had made all the difference. Beatrice had gone from having nothing and no one to having a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that sustained her through everything. It had started with a cowboy finding her praying alone in a church and telling her that her prayers were answered. And he had been right. Her prayers had been answered beyond anything she could have imagined. Years later, when Garrett and Beatrice were in their 70s, they were great-grandparents many times over. The Nelson Ranch had been passed down to Grant, who ran it with the same care and integrity his father had. The family gathered every summer for a reunion, and the house was filled with children's laughter and love. Beatrice had published a book of her educational essays that had become required reading in teacher training programs throughout the country. Garrett had been recognized by the Kansas Cattlemen's Association for his contributions to ranching practices. But their greatest accomplishment was the family they had raised and the love they had maintained. On a warm evening in June, 50 years to the day after their wedding, Garrett and Beatrice renewed their vows in the same church where they had first met. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren surrounded them as Reverend Parker's grandson, now the minister of the church, presided over the ceremony. 50 years ago, these two people came together in love, the young reverend said. And that love has created ripples that extend far beyond this church, this town, this state. The love between Garrett and Beatrice Nelson has built a family, enriched a community, and touched countless lives. It is a testament to what two people can accomplish when they face life together with courage, commitment, and compassion. When they exchanged their vows again, there was not a dry eye in the church. Grant stood beside his father as best man, just as his son would stand beside him one day. Grace dabbed at her tears with a lace handkerchief. George had his arm around his wife, and even the great-grandchildren were quiet and solemn, sensing the importance of the moment. "I would marry you again in a heartbeat," Garrett said, his voice still strong despite his advanced years. "Every day with you has been a gift, Beatrice. You are my greatest blessing." "And you are mine," Beatrice replied, her voice wavering with emotion. "You were the answer to my prayers 50 years ago, and you have been the answer to every prayer since. I love you, Garrett Nelson, with all that I am." They kissed, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration that followed was joyous and heartfelt, with dancing and food and speeches. Beatrice's former students, now middle-aged themselves, came to pay their respects and share stories of how she had influenced their lives. Helena Schmidt, now a renowned educator with her own school, gave a moving tribute to the woman who had believed in her when no one else did. As the evening wore on and the party began to wind down, Garrett and Beatrice slipped away to the church. They went inside and stood in the empty space, illuminated by moonlight streaming through the windows. "This is where it all began," Beatrice said, moving to the spot where she had been kneeling that day so long ago. "Right here. I was so scared and alone, and I did not know if I would survive another day. And I walked through that door and saw you," Garrett continued, standing where he had stood that day. "And something inside me knew that my life was about to change forever." "You told me my prayers were answered," Beatrice said, smiling at the memory. "You were so confident, even though you had no idea what I was praying for." "I was confident because it was the truth," Garrett replied. "Your prayers were answered, Beatrice. And so were mine, though I did not even know I was praying. I was praying for purpose, for love, for a partner to share my life with. And God sent me you." They held each other in that church, two people who had built a lifetime together from a single moment of faith and chance. Outside, their family waited to take them back to the ranch. Inside, they stood in the place where their love story had begun, grateful for every moment they had been given. Garrett Nelson lived to be 78 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep on a cold December night with Beatrice holding his hand. His last words to her were, "Thank you for saying yes." Beatrice lived another 5 years after Garrett's death, surrounded by her loving family. She spent her final years writing her memoirs, wanting to leave a record of their love story for future generations. The book, titled Prayers Answered, became a bestseller and inspired countless readers. When Beatrice died at 83, she was laid to rest beside Garrett in the Wilson Cemetery. The entire town turned out for her funeral, along with former students, fellow educators, and family members from across the country. The eulogy was given by Grant, who spoke movingly about his parents' love and the legacy they had left behind. "My parents' love story began in a church with a prayer and a promise," Grant said. "And it continued for 51 years through joy and sorrow, triumph and hardship. They showed all of us what real love looks like: patient, kind, enduring, and true. They built something that will last long after they are gone, not just in the family they created, but in the lives they touched and the love they shared so generously with everyone they met." On Beatrice's gravestone beside Garrett's was inscribed a simple phrase that summed up their entire story: "Your prayers are answered." The Nelson Ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the family. The schoolhouse where Beatrice taught still stands, now a museum dedicated to rural education in the Old West. Wilson, Kansas, grew and changed over the years, but the story of the cowboy who found a praying woman in a church and told her that her prayers were answered became local legend, told and retold to visitors and new residents. It was a story of faith, hope, and love. It was a story of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and built a life together that exceeded their wildest dreams. It was a story that proved that sometimes prayers really are answered, often in ways we could never have imagined. And it all began with a desperate woman kneeling in an empty church, whispering a prayer for help, and a kind cowboy who walked through the door at exactly the right moment to say, "Your prayers are answered."